I don't want to sound like a doomsayer, but I'm starting to get seriously worried about Breath of the Wild 2. Greetings adventurers, Delver here. Now I'm a massive Zelda fan. It's without question my favorite game series of all time. I've thoroughly enjoyed every entry in the series, and like most, I was extremely hyped when they announced a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, and then it went radio silent for 4 years. Now I know what you're thinking. What's the big deal? After all, Breath of the Wild took 6 years to develop. Well, in order to explain how this is different, I'll first need to go over the typical Zelda release cycle. A typical console Zelda game seems to take approximately 4 years to complete. I'm basing this off of A Link to the Past and Twilight Princess, which by all accounts had the smoothest developments in the series. We can use this 4-year cycle as a baseline and then examine what caused other entries to deviate from it. Starting with the games that took more than 4 years, Ocarina of Time still holds the series record at 7 years. However, it was the first 3D Zelda, as well as one of the first 3D action-adventure games in general, which I think is a pretty reasonable explanation. They really took their time to make it as solid as possible, and the results speak for themselves. As previously mentioned, Breath of the Wild is next up, clocking in at 6 years, and again, this one is pretty self-explanatory. It was the first open-world Zelda game, it drastically overhauled the series formula to a degree surpassing even Ocarina, it had in-depth physics and simulation elements to the point that some even consider it a full-blown immersive sim, and of course it had to switch development to an entirely different console at the 11th hour. And lastly, we have Skyward Sword, which is a bit of an odd case, because while it technically took 5 years to develop, 2 of those were spent meandering in pre-production owing to the fact that the Wii Motion Plus hadn't been invented yet, so the actual development was really more like 3 years. So that covers the games that took more than 4 years, but what about the games that took less? Well, that would be Majora's Mask, which was famously developed in only 1 year, and Wind Waker, which was released just 2 years later. In the case of Wind Waker, the game was very clearly rushed. At least 2 dungeons were cut late into development, and the game has some of the most egregious padding in the entire series. Majora's Mask wasn't rushed per se, but its rapid turnaround was only possible because it reused the same engine as Ocarina, along with most of its assets as well. Additionally, the game was much shorter, with only 4 main dungeons and a greater emphasis on side quests. So to summarize, without rushing it, it takes about 4 years to develop a brand new console Zelda game, and the games that took longer did so because of some kind of development hurdle usually relating to technology. Now let's consider Breath of the Wild 2. In many ways, the game is quite similar to Majora's Mask. It's a direct sequel, and it reuses the same engine and assets as its predecessor. In fact, Breath of the Wild is even more iterative than Majora because it will also be reusing the same world map. The only new additions appear to be some floating islands, which look to be a new take on shrines, and some variations on existing enemies and Sheikah Slate powers. To put it bluntly, the game doesn't look like a sequel so much as an expansion pack. And that's not hyperbole. The idea to do a direct sequel came from the developers having too many DLC ideas. Of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with an iterative sequel, but it does beg the question, what's taking so long? All of the heavy lifting is basically done. They're not making a new game from scratch, they're making standalone DLC. The DLC for Breath of the Wild came out the same year as the base game, so they clearly know how to create content quickly in this framework. I've already mentioned Majora's Mask, but if you look at the handheld games, which already have shorter developments, the ones that recycle engines and assets are typically finished within 2 years at most. And yet, Breath of the Wild 2, despite being in development for as long as a full-blown installment, still has no official title, no firm release date, and only one very brief gameplay trailer. And if the leakers are to be believed, and Nintendo has another Zelda-related project releasing this year, probably Switch ports of the Wii U HD remakes, then that means it's probably going to be pushed back into 2023, meaning it will have been in development for as long as its predecessor. And frankly, that has me seriously worried, because the only explanation I can think of is that the game is undergoing the worst development hell in series history. Literally every indication says that this game should have been done by 2020 at the latest. Even if we account for the pandemic, there's absolutely no reason we should be sitting here in 2022 with the game still shrouded in mystery. I'm worried about what this could mean for the final product. Nintendo doesn't release broken games, so we don't need to worry about another Cyberpunk, but I'm worried this could end up being the most disappointing entry in the series, even more than Skyward Sword. Breath of the Wild blew us all away with its incredible world design, environmental simulation, and game-changing traversal mechanics that came together to create one of the most intrinsically compelling gameplay loops in the entire open-world genre. But it also had the most critical flaws of any game in the series. Every aspect of its combat system, from weapon durability to defense to cooking to the hidden XP system, is horrendously unbalanced. The story is virtually non-existent and most of the characters are lifeless husks. The side quests are meaningless filler and the main story quests are hardly any better. And as good as the world design is, much of the content that populates it is heavily copy-pasted, and the emphasis on absolute freedom leaves the game bereft of any sense of progression in its gameplay or narrative, a problem only compounded by the inexcusable lack of proper dungeons or bosses. It was a paradigm shift for the series, one that I still believe was necessary, but it's also an incomplete paradigm shift. It broke away from the linearity and hand-holding that was starting to strangle the series, but in doing so it also abandoned much of what made the series special in the first place. Much ado has been made comparing it to the original Legend of Zelda, but that game was ultimately a prototype for A Link to the Past. Breath of the Wild desperately needs a similar kind of follow-up, and I'm not sure if a standalone expansion pack mired in development hell can do that. If Breath of the Wild 2 comes out after this long of a wait and it's just the first game again, I think a lot of players, myself included, are going to be very disappointed. The game won't be able to ride that wow factor anymore, and I think that will only serve to highlight its underlying issues. And that's a big problem, because I don't think Zelda can survive as just another open world game. The market is already saturated with open world games, many of which do at least one thing substantially better. Horizon Forbidden West has similar traversal mechanics set in a more detailed and beautiful world. Elden Ring has vastly superior dungeons, even Hyrule Castle, Breath of the Wild's very best level, which was built up over your entire playthrough, already feels outshined by Elden Ring's first major dungeon. And that's on top of better combat, enemy variety, and an actual sense of progression. Fallout New Vegas, The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, and in all likelihood the upcoming Avowed, all have better writing and characters. And do I even need to bring up sandbox survival games? Zelda can't survive as a jack-of-all-trades in a genre already plagued by homogenized design. Remember how Assassin's Creed used to be a historically authentic stealth action game with memorable characters and an engaging plot? It used to be a series with a unique identity. Now it's just another bloated open-world grindfest so divorced from its original concept that the name doesn't even fit anymore. I don't want to see that kind of thing happen to Zelda. Don't get me wrong, it certainly won't happen overnight. Breath of the Wild 2 will no doubt be showered in perfect scores on release, but once the honeymoon period is over, I think the game will be scrutinized far harsher than any previous entry, and it will not only be forced to justify itself, but also prove that this new era of Zelda is one worth being excited for. That's quite a lot to hang on the shoulders of a standalone expansion pack that still doesn't have a title or firm release date. I'd like to hope that Nintendo is aware of these issues, and addressing them is the reason such a seemingly simple project has been in development for so long. But Breath of the Wild was both a massive commercial hit and a critical darling, and that kind of success rarely leads to introspection. But what do you think? Are my worries justified, or am I just being overly pessimistic? Feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm the Rambling Rune Pony, thanks for watching.